Welcome to Craving the Heat, where desire takes the lead and every story leaves you wanting more. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments and keep up with our latest naughty stories. It started with something as ordinary as a parent-teacher meeting. I had been teaching for nearly 8 years, long enough to believe I'd seen just about every type of parent. The anxious ones who hovered, the defensive ones who blamed everyone, but their child, and the proud ones who glowed at every small accomplishment. But when Rachel walked into my classroom that evening, something shifted in me in a way I couldn't have predicted. She wasn't flashy or loud. In fact, she carried herself with a kind of quiet grace that seemed almost out of place in the fluorescent lit classroom. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes tired but warm. When she introduced herself as Daniel's mother, I remember fumbling for words, suddenly more aware of my own posture, the way my shirt collar sat uneven against my neck. She smiled politely, sat down, and began asking thoughtful questions about her son, not the usual grade-obsessed interrogation, but real concerns about his confidence, his friendships, the way he seemed withdrawn at times. For a teacher, there's nothing more disarming than a parent who actually listens, who doesn't just want numbers on a report card, but wants to know who their child is becoming. I found myself talking more than I should have, not just about Daniel, but about how kids at that age struggle with identity, how home life shapes them in ways they don't yet realize. She listened with an attentiveness that made me feel seen. That was the first time I noticed the pull. Over the following weeks, Rachel became a familiar presence. She volunteered for class events. She stopped by to check on Daniel, and sometimes, when other parents had rushed out, she lingered to ask about books I'd recommended or to share something Daniel had said at home. Our conversations grew longer, less about her son and more about life, hers, mine, in careful fragments. She told me about her marriage, how it had become something of a routine, how she and her husband had started to live parallel lives. She laughed when she admitted she sometimes envied the excitement her son found in little things, saying it had been years since she felt that kind of spark herself. I should have stopped it there, drawn a line, reminded myself that she wasn't just another woman, but the mother of a student who trusted me. But there was something magnetic about the way she spoke, the way her eyes softened when she shared something vulnerable. I began to look forward to her visits more than I should have. My days were measured not by lessons taught, but by the chance of seeing her at the end of them. One rainy afternoon, after most parents had picked up their children, Daniel lingered, waiting for his father who was running late. Rachel arrived instead, apologizing breathlessly for the mix-up, her umbrella dripping on the linoleum floor. We laughed at the chaos, but when Daniel ran ahead to get his things, she and I found ourselves alone for a few seconds longer than we should have been. She thanked me for caring, for paying attention, for being someone her son trusted. Her voice cracked slightly, and before I could respond, she placed her hand over mine on the desk. It was brief, almost nothing, but it was enough to send a current through me that I couldn't ignore. From then on, it wasn't just conversations, it was stolen moments. A glance held a beat too long. A text message that had nothing to do with school. A coffee shop encounter. That just happened on a Saturday morning when we both knew we had planned it. Each step felt like a line we weren't supposed to cross, but by the time we realized how far we had wandered, the line was already behind us. The night everything changed was during the school's spring fundraiser. Parents, teachers, and students all packed into the decorated gymnasium. Rachel looked different that night, radiant in a way that made it hard for me to focus on anything else. I tried to play the role of the responsible teacher, but our eyes kept finding each other across the room, as if drawn by some unspoken gravity. When the event ended and the crowd thinned, she offered me a ride home since I lived nearby. I should have said no. I didn't. The car ride was quiet at first, the air charged with the weight of everything we hadn't said. Halfway down the street, she pulled over, turned to me, and whispered, "This feels wrong, doesn't it?" I nodded, but neither of us moved. Her hand trembled as she reached for mine, and before I knew it, we were leaning toward each other, the world outside the car blurring into irrelevance. That kiss was hesitant, almost questioning. But once it began, it was impossible to stop Dot after that night. We told ourselves it would be the last time, but it wasn't. We carved out secret pockets of time late night walks, hidden corners of cafes, moments stolen between the responsibilities of her life and mine. I learned about the quiet ache she carried, the loneliness that no one else seemed to notice. She learned about the emptiness I felt outside of the classroom, the way I had buried myself in work to avoid admitting how disconnected I'd become from my own life. Thought it wasn't just physical, it was emotional, raw and terrifying. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't for years, and I think I did the same for her. But every time I saw Daniel in class, every time he looked up at me with trust in his eyes, guilt clawed at my chest. I was betraying not just her husband, but her. Son, the boy who believed I was someone worth looking up to. The affair didn't last forever. They never do. Secrets like ours are heavy, and eventually they demand to be confronted. But the truth is, that chapter of my life changed me in ways I still struggle to put into words. Rachel wasn't just my student's mother. She was the woman who, for a brief stolen stretch of time, reminded me what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, to be alive. And though it ended, the memory of it lingers, as complicated and unforgettable as the first moment our eyes met across that. Classroom. Rachel and I both pretended, at least at first, that what happened between us in her car was an accident, a lapse of judgment. We told ourselves we'd bury it, move forward, pretend it hadn't happened. For a few weeks, we kept our distance, our conversations reduced to polite nods, our texts carefully worded to sound professional. I threw myself into teaching, determined to put my energy into my students, into lesson plans, into anything that could distract me from the memory of her lips brushing mine. But suppression is a fragile thing. It only takes the smallest crack for everything to come rushing back. For us, it was a Saturday morning. Daniel had forgotten an assignment folder in the classroom, and Rachel texted, asking if she could stop by and pick it up. I told myself it was innocent, that I was doing my job, but my hands shook as I unlocked the school door. She came in, hair loose this time, dressed casually. Yet she carried herself with the same quiet grace that had undone me before. We searched for the folder, laughing at the mess of papers on my desk, until she found it tucked under a pile of essays. She should have left then. I should have let her go. But instead she lingered. She asked if I ever felt lonely when the classroom was this empty, when the noise of children wasn't there to fill the silence. I admitted that I did. And then she admitted something in return, that the silence at home was even worse. Her eyes glistened, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and brushed away a tear that slid down her cheek. That small gesture unraveled everything. She stepped closer, and I didn't step back. Our lips met again, softer this time, more desperate, as though we both knew the weight of what we were doing but couldn't resist it. It was the beginning of something neither of us had planned, but both of us craved. From then on, we were tangled in each other's lives in ways we couldn't easily undo. We found excuses to meet at coffee shops out of town, at bookstores where no one would recognize us, on late evening walks when her husband worked late. We didn't need elaborate plans. We just needed time. Every touch, every laugh, every stolen moment stitched us closer together. Even as guilt gnawed at the edges of our happiness, I would lie awake at night, torn between exhilaration and shame. I knew what we were doing was wrong to her. Husband, wrong to Daniel, wrong to the role I was supposed to uphold. And yet, when I thought about her smile, her hand in mine, her voice whispering truths she had never told anyone else, I couldn't bring myself to let go. She saw me in a way no one else ever had, and I saw her not just as someone's wife or someone's mother, but as a woman who had been starving for affection, for acknowledgement, for love. The danger of what we had became real one evening when we nearly got caught. We had met at a quiet park, sitting on a bench tucked away from the main path, just talking when another parent from school happened to walk by. Rachel's hand slipped from mine instantly, her body shifting away with practice. speed, but the look of panic in her eyes haunted me. We sat in silence afterward, both of us knowing the risk was growing heavier, that the walls around our secret were thinner than we wanted to admit, yet the fear only seemed to deepen the intensity. Every meeting after that felt urgent, fragile, like it could be the last. I found myself memorizing the way her laughter curled at the end, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she said my name as though it held more meaning than anyone else ever gave it. She would send me small texts late at night, half a sentence, sometimes just a word that I would cling to like oxygen. But love built on secrecy always carries cracks. The first fracture came one afternoon when she admitted she was starting to feel guilty in a way she couldn't shake. She told me about Daniel, how he had asked why she seemed happier lately, how he noticed the difference even if he didn't understand it. She said she couldn't look at him without wondering if he would someday discover the truth. Her voice trembled as she told me she didn't want to hurt him, that she didn't want to destroy his image of me, his trust in her. I listened, torn between wanting to reassure her and knowing she was right. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, realizing we were standing on a cliff edge. Either we would pull back now, or we would tumble over completely. But pulling back wasn't simple. Feelings don't just disappear because they're inconvenient. When we tried to stop seeing each other, it lasted barely a week. A message from her would appear on my phone, or I would catch sight of her across the school parking lot, and all of our restraint would dissolve. We were addicts, not to the secrecy, but to each other. The eventual unraveling wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no bitter confrontation. Instead, it was Rachel's quiet resolve that ended it. One evening, she came to me with tears in her eyes and said she couldn't keep living in two worlds, that it wasn't fair to her son, her husband, or to me. She said I deserved someone I could hold in the daylight, someone I didn't have to hide. Her voice broke as she told me she loved me, but love wasn't always enough. I didn't argue. I wanted to, but I could see the exhaustion in her face, the burden she carried. So I nodded, though it felt like tearing my own heart in two. We parted that night, no promises, no grand declarations, just silence heavy enough to last a lifetime. Weeks turned into months. She withdrew from school events, her presence fading little by little until she was just another parent again, someone I passed in the hallways with a polite smile. Our eyes still found each other sometimes, but the weight of everything unspoken between us was too much to bear. Life moved on, as it always does. Daniel grew, graduated, and I eventually transferred to another school, carrying with me memories I never spoke of. But even now, years later, there are nights when I dream of her laughter, of the way she looked at me when no one else was watching, of the secret world we built and lost. Rachel was my student's mother, but for a fleeting, impossible stretch of time. She was also the woman who taught me more than I ever thought I'd learn about love, loneliness, and the price of choices. We can never take back. Rachel's decision to end things didn't erase the weight of what had already happened. It only left it hanging between us like an unfinished sentence. For months after that night, I walked around with a hollow ache I couldn't quite put into words. Teaching became mechanical. I'd stand in front of the class, delivering lessons with a steady voice, but inside, everything felt muted. The laughter of my students no longer lifted me the way it once had. Every now and then, I'd catch Daniel's face lit up with excitement when he grasped a new concept, and it would hit me like a blow. I had betrayed his trust without him even knowing. Rachel avoided me whenever possible. She still came to parent-teacher meetings, but her husband was always by her side now. She would sit quietly, smiling politely, and though she tried not to meet my eyes, there were moments when our gazes locked, just long enough to remind me of everything we had buried. In those moments, I saw not only her longing, but also her guilt. It was a mirror of my own. One night, months later, I got a text from her. It wasn't a declaration of regret or longing, it was just 5 words. I don't know who I am. I stared at it for what felt like hours before replying. I told her she was someone who had been neglected for too long, someone who had found herself caught in a storm she didn't create. She didn't respond, and I thought that was the end of it. But a week later, she asked if I could meet her at a small cafe on the edge of town. I almost said no, fearing what would happen if we crossed that line again, but the truth was I couldn't resist the pull of her. When I walked in, she was already there, a book open in front of her that she clearly wasn't reading. She looked, tired, her hair pulled back, shadows under her eyes, but when she saw me, something softened. We didn't touch. We didn't even sit too close. Instead, we talked. She told me her marriage had always been brittle, held together by routines and appearances, and that what we shared had shaken her awake in ways she didn't expect. She admitted she still thought about me every day, but she was determined not to let herself spiral back into something she couldn't manage. She wanted to figure out who she was beyond being a wife, a mother, or even the woman who had fallen for me. Listening to her, I realized something. As much as I loved her, as much as I wanted her, maybe part of loving her meant letting her rediscover herself without me pulling her in two directions. That realization didn't make the longing disappear. It only made it sharper, more bittersweet. Years passed. She and her husband stayed together, though I always wondered at what cost. I moved to a different school, then eventually to a different city, trying to outrun the ghost of what we had. But every so often, when the quiet of a classroom felt too heavy, or when I caught a glimpse of someone who resembled her in a crowd, the memories returned. The last time I saw Rachel was by chance. It was years later at a bookstore in another town. I almost didn't recognize her at first, her hair shorter, her style different, but her eyes still carrying that same depth I'd once fallen into. She was alone, and when she noticed me, we froze. For a moment, I thought she might turn and walk away, but instead she smiled. We talked like old acquaintances, polite and measured. She told me Daniel was thriving, that life was steady. She didn't mention her husband, and I didn't ask. When it was time to part, she touched my hand lightly, the way someone might when saying goodbye to a stranger they once knew intimately. Night, I lay awake thinking about her, not about what we had lost, but about what we had given each other, however fleeting. We had been wrong, reckless, tangled in something we shouldn't have touched. But beneath all of that, we had been two lonely souls who found solace, however briefly, in each other's arms. And maybe that was enough. Life has a way of circling back to things you thought were buried. Years after my last encounter with Rachel, at that bookstore I had moved on in all the practical ways a person can. I'd built a new life in another city, earned a reputation as a reliable teacher, even started dating again. But the truth was, no matter who I was with, there was always some quiet part of me that compared them to her. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality I carried. It was Daniel who pulled the past back into my present. He was no longer the eager boy who once stayed after class to ask questions. He was a young man, taller, sharper around the edges, with a confidence that only comes from pushing through the awkwardness of adolescence. I ran into him at a university campus where I had been invited to give a guest lecture. He recognized me instantly, and the smile he gave me was one I hadn't expected, warm, unburdened, as though I was someone who had genuinely mattered in his life. "Mr. Carter," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "you were the reason I even thought about studying literature. I owe you more than you realize." The pride I felt was real, but it was laced with guilt. He saw me as a mentor, someone who had believed in him. He had no idea that behind his back, I had crossed into a place I never should have gone with his mother. We caught up over coffee, and he told me about his ambitions, his hopes for grad school, how he wanted to travel and write. As I listened, I couldn't help but see flashes of Rachel in him. The same determination, the same restless spirit. When he mentioned her, his voice softened. "Mom's doing better these days. She seems freer, I guess, happier." That word happier sat heavy with me. I wondered what it meant. Had she finally let go of her marriage? Had she found herself in ways she once told me she needed? I didn't ask, though the temptation clawed at me. Weeks later, I got my answer. Daniel invited me to a small gathering at his mother's house. a kind of informal dinner to celebrate his acceptance into a graduate program. I almost refused, terrified of what it would mean to see her again in the space where everything had once begun. But I told myself enough time had passed, that we were older, wiser, that the ghost would stay buried if I kept my distance. When I arrived, Rachel opened the door. For a moment, it felt like time had collapsed into itself. She hadn't changed. In essence, her eyes still carried the same depth, her smile still both cautious and kind, but there was something different about her. A quiet confidence, a peace I hadn't seen before. She greeted me warmly, as though we were old friends, not two people who had once risked everything in the shadows of her living room. The evening passed in polite conversation, laughter, and the glow of Daniel's excitement about his future. But every now and then, Rachel and I would catch each other's eyes across the room, and it was as though an entire unspoken history unfolded in that one glance. There was no bitterness, no anger, just a shared recognition of what we had been, and what we could never be again. Later that night, after everyone had left, I lingered at the door, thanking her for hosting. She walked me out, and for the first time in years, we were alone. The silence between us was thick, but not hostile. She looked at me and said quietly, "You were important to me, more than I should have let you be, but I don't regret knowing you." I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, and for a long moment I just stood there, searching for words that wouldn't ruin the fragile peace we had built. Finally, I managed, "You saved me too, Rachel. In ways I can't explain." Her eyes glistened, and for a second, it felt like we were standing on the edge of that dangerous cliff again, about to fall back into something neither of us could control. But she stepped back, her hand resting briefly on mine before she let go. "Good night," she whispered. And the door closed softly behind her. Driving home, I realized something had shifted. The ache I had carried for years wasn't gone, but it no longer ruled me. Seeing her again, hearing her words, allowed me to understand that what we had was never meant to be a lifelong entanglement. It was a chapter. Intense and complicated, but a chapter nonetheless. Daniel and I stayed in touch, and I watched from a distance as he grew into the man he was destined to be. Each time I saw him, I felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange pride, as though in some indirect way, I had been part of his story too. Rachel and I never crossed that line again, but the memory of that summer, that affair, remained etched in both of us, a secret that shaped us, scarred us, and in some ways set us free.